Mutation Genesis from the Fempiror Chronicles by George Willson. Chapter 14 Rastem vs. Mutation. Tiberius led a group of 20 Rastem through the narrow, sunlit streets of Aram. With the exception of the main streets that led out of town from the Tepish fortress, Aram consisted of narrow paths between the buildings primarily intended for walking 2 or 3 abreast at most. Ever since the Tepish had either killed, transmutated, or just frightened away the former human populace of the city, Aram appeared to be little more than a well-maintained ghost town on the plains of the countryside. He knew of humans discovering the town on several occasions, but they rarely stayed for long. Some of those that tried to adopt Aram as a permanent residence found themselves as Fempiror before morning, which led the Rastem and Alewo to drive any newcomers out of town as soon as possible if they were the first to discover them. They had hardly left their outpost out the back door of the general store just before sunrise when the Tepish patrol poured into it through the front door, wearing day travel cloaks. Normally, in a day passage such as this, they would pass in full view of the windows of the fortress to mock the Tepish inside. But under the circumstances, Tiberius was more interested in keeping a low profile. The last thing he needed was for the Tepish to know in which direction their next outpost would be located. He had planned to use Aram's limited sewer system as a cover to reach their ultimate destination, and as the Rastem used it regularly, he knew where he planned to go once he had his people underground. Unfortunately, the plan had not gone well at all. Their first tunnel had involved a series of brief encounters with several groups of Tepish guards waiting for them. The battles had cost them several Rastem and revealed that the Tepish had seen through his brilliant idea. To complicate things further, the Tepish they encountered had blocked the passage, and behind that barricade he had seen more Tepish troops. Rather than risk another fight, Tiberius took everyone back the way they had come before the Tepish had a chance to work their way around and cut them off. They had moved the majority of the way in the sunlight after that, not willing to take the chance of more encounters underground. The Rastem were all dressed in the dark day travel cloaks and cloth gloves to protect them from the overhead sun. Moving around in the daytime, cloaks or no cloaks, always made Tiberius nervous. But it provided the best chance they had of getting from their old outpost to a new one on the other side of town. He hoped the place he had in mind would remain uncompromised. Still, the biggest hurdle remained ahead of them. Even though the Tepish were guarding the tunnels, he knew they had to risk the tunnel that would lead them past the fortress, since the fortress looked down main artery streets in all directions. The last tunnel showed him how fruitless that idea would prove to be when he found that the Tepish had blocked that tunnel with debris right up to the entrance. The Tepish knew they would be out during the day, and they knew the Rastem would have to cross one of the main streets. He wondered if they were planning some kind of ambush for them from the tower. He had to hazard a look at the Tepish fortress to see what, if anything, might await them to see what hope they had of an open crossing. He approached the edge of a building and brought his company to a halt. He carefully looked around the corner toward the massive Tepish fortress at the center of town, about a half-mile up the street. Standing before the entryway of the fortress were 11 men, dressed in a shirt and breeches without stockings or shoes. Most of them were hunched over, their arms hanging toward the ground, and 1 or 2 of them were resting their fingertips on the ground. But what really surprised him about these guards was that they were standing freely in the sunlight. Tiberius was perplexed. The Tepish would not employ humans for anything, even watching for Rastem. But these could not be Fempiror either, as they stood in the open sunlight and did not burn. He turned to Kaltesh, who stood behind him. "Kaltesh," he said, "what do you make of this?" Tiberius stepped back to allow Kaltesh to sidle up to the corner and look at the strange men outside the fortress. "Perhaps it is some kind of blocker on the skin," Kaltesh suggested. It was a reasonable suggestion. Over the years, the Fempiror had attempted to manufacture creams and lotions to block the part of the sun that hurt them, but none of them was as effective as the day travel cloak, since it was too easy to miss a part of your body. But another, more frightening idea formed in Tiberius' mind. Or maybe there is more to this Tepish mutation than we initially believed, Tiberius guessed. Resilience to sunlight, Kaltesh asked, amazed. Maybe so, Tiberius nodded. We cannot go this way, though. We have to find another way around. Fall back. He and Kaltesh backed away from the corner and turned to the waiting Rastem. Tiberius stood before them as they gathered around him in a small, tight group. Everyone, Tiberius began, we're taking a different path. This way is guarded, and we cannot chance a battle under the sun and losing our cloaks. The Rastem universally nodded their assent to the change of plan. Tiberius walked to Yori, standing among the others. Yori kept her blonde hair tied up in a tight bun, and though her bright hazel eyes had lost some of their youthful enthusiasm during these difficult times, she maintained her permanent smile as she looked at Tiberius. Yori's Rastem garb differed from even other female Rastem, in that she had personally recut her trousers and shirt to accommodate her feminine form, and even David, with his tailor background, had admired her workmanship on it. Tiberius relied on Yori for her knowledge of the hidden ways of the city, and her uncanny ability to find her way blindly through nearly any maze. Yori, I don't suppose you know of another way around, Tiberius asked her sharply. Our options are extremely limited, Tiberius, she said uninspiringly. We can assume the tunnels are out of the question. They may have driven everyone out of town, but they keep it completely free of debris, so we can't hide behind anything. They've destroyed every building that could block their view of our escape from this part of town. We can double back and go out of town to try to get behind them. Otherwise, we'll need to find an outpost in this quadrant, or go back to our old one, and hope the Tepish are gone. We can't go back, Tiberius said. Surely they wouldn't expect us to return, Yori protested. Yori, I would anticipate it if I were them, he said. They would outnumber us easily in there, or worse, just kill us by setting everything down there on fire. We'll hole up somewhere if we have to, but we can't go back. Yori stared at him for a long moment, but finally nodded. Very well, she said. He knew she, along with everyone else, would follow him anywhere. He could not let them down. Let's go, he said, and they moved away from the road back the way they came. He was not sure where they would end up, but he was certain that the Tepish had trapped them in this quarter if they hoped to stay hidden. He knew their last alternative would be to leave Aram entirely, but that would risk allowing the Tepish more freedom in Aram, and possibly beyond. He could not do that. His mind raced with options. The myriad of closed buildings could provide limited cover, but they were all open and above ground. The cellar they had found before was a chance discovery, and their original destination provided a similar below-ground solution. He could not be sure that an above-ground outpost would provide the cover the Rastem desperately needed until nightfall. Should they just leave town for the day? He knew that the Tepish would still feel trapped, since the Rastem would remain just as hidden. They could return tonight, but then these day warriors could cause problems. Since the Rastem and Tepish were both nocturnal, the Rastem had kept a minimal watch during the day, and like the Rastem, the Tepish never wanted to risk a daytime attack and losing the day travel cloaks. What was that? He heard one of the Rastem mutter. He turned to find Boltash, a newer Rastem who appeared to be in his early 30s with a frown-set mouth, large mustache, and tousled black hair that he kept fairly short, looking down a space between two buildings. Boltash turned to Tiberius, and then back to the building gap. He approached Tiberius, and Tiberius looked into Boltash's serious, observant brown eyes as Boltash stopped beside him. Tiberius, Boltash began, something passed the alley back there. It is moving quickly. Did you see it? Tiberius asked. Boltash shook his head. Only a glimpse as it ran past, he said. Any idea what it was? Tiberius asked, fearing the worst. Boltash shook his head again. Tiberius suspected that if these mutations could move in the daylight, then the Tepish would send them out to take down anyone moving during the day. They would need to find cover quickly, and Tiberius knew the best place to deal with this. At this point, it was their only choice. "We have to move," Tiberius told Boltash quickly. "Pass the word. Hold your cloaks. We're going to have to run." Boltash sprinted back along the length of the Rastem column, repeating the message as he went. Tiberius turned, held his hood in place, and ran. The rest of the Rastem followed suit behind him. Even though the day travel cloaks were made of a thick material that tended to stay in place, Tiberius had found that a rapid sprint could throw a hood back unexpectedly. He cut back north through an alleyway and looked ahead of him. 2 blocks ahead of them was a wide courtyard, and at the far end of that courtyard, the awning of an old church. The church had been in Aram almost as long as the town had been in place, and would not only serve as a sanctuary for them, but a possible escape to a series of catacombs beneath it. They had never used it as an outpost out of respect. Tiberius had to acknowledge that faith in a higher power had sustained him in his darker moments, when his endless life of night had been unbearable. Tiberius glanced back to find 6 of the mutations center in behind them. Unlike the Rastem, these mutations ran on all 4s like animals. Their faces glared hungrily forward, their mouths apparently salivating as they watched the Rastem like lions would watch gazelles. Tiberius' hood flipped away from his face just a little, exposing part of his neck to a ray of sunlight, which brought his mind out of the distraction of their pursuers as the sun burnt him. Never missing a step, he flipped his hood back to protect his skin. They crossed the first street, and another mutation leapt from the side of the road, taking one of the Rastem to the ground. Tiberius could not tell who it was, but as the Rastem struggled to fight back, the mutation simply tore the day travel cloak from his victim. As the sun did its work, Tiberius was horrified to see the mutation lean in and bite the back of the victim's neck, which severed the head's connection with the rest of the body and caused the unfortunate Rastem to go immediately limp. Tiberius turned away without watching what he had learned in the meeting would happen next. The remaining Rastem crossed the second street and only had the courtyard to get past before they had some measure of relative safety. Unfortunately, the remainder of the mutations had come around the other directions surrounding them and cutting them off from the church. The group stopped in the courtyard momentarily to assess the threat, but the pause was all their enemies needed. The mutations from behind wasted no time in attacking. The first pounced on Kaltesh, who immediately threw the mutation off, but another came in right behind the first and took down Kaltesh's hood. Tiberius turned and kicked the second mutation from Kaltesh's back. Kaltesh restored his hood and shared a glance with Tiberius. Tiberius could see that the sun had burned Kaltesh a little, but he would be all right. They needed to get under cover. "Into the doorway," Tiberius yelled. "Out of the sun." The 5 mutations who had cut them off blocked the awning ahead of them, while the others attacked from behind. They had no choice, though. They needed to fight, or they would be overwhelmed. Tiberius drew his sword, and the others quickly followed his lead. The mutations continued to attack from behind, and although the Rastem moved quickly, the mutations dodged the blows just as fast. Without gauntlets or weapons, the mutations were as formidable as the Alewo. They did not need to block the swords of the Rastem. The Rastem could not land any blows. One by one, the mutations took an opening and leapt onto a Rastem, tearing back their hoods and biting into their necks. The mutations guarding the door suddenly joined the fray to prevent the Rastem from rescuing each other, and to find their own victim in the chaos. Although the Rastem tried to prevent the mutations from feasting on the blood of their comrades, in the end, only half of the original contingency of Rastem reached the sanctuary of the awning, as the sun's rays forced them one by one to abandon their fallen brethren. They watched as the mutations, all of whom were unhurt, were apparently drinking the blood of the dead and burning Rastem. Tiberius, along with everyone else, stared in horror at the impossible sight of Fempiror operating in the sunlight, and yet acting like animals. Truly, these things were mutations, for they were not the creation of Voivode Draculia. Kaltesh stood beside Tiberius, his sword at the ready. "What do we do, Tiberius?" Kaltesh asked desperately. Tiberius glanced at his old friend and saw the encounter had badly burned his face. He looked at the others standing around them and saw various burns on everyone. If they survived this day, the wounds would heal. He looked back to the mutations and found one looking at his victim curiously. Tiberius watched, wondering what the thing was thinking. Slowly it turned its head to stare directly at Tiberius, blood staining its chin. Tiberius understood instantly as it reoriented itself to face the remaining Rastem. The thing acted on pure hunting instinct, and it only saw the living Rastem as a means to satisfy its hunger. If they did not move, they would be next. "Retreat into the church," Tiberius said quickly, backing away from the mutations. "Now, we will try to hold our own as they enter." The Rastem at the rear of the formation quickly opened the large wooden doors to the church and allowed everyone to pass inside. As he crossed the threshold of the door, Tiberius glanced back and saw the mutation who had looked at him charge full speed for the door before the other Rastem slammed the doors behind them. "Hold the doors," Tiberius ordered. As soon as the doors closed, the company braced themselves against them. The mutation hit the outside of the doors hard, and the impact echoed across the expanse of the church behind them. He hit the doors twice more, and then stopped. A huge ancient wooden plank stood beside the entrance, and probably had been unused in as long as the church had been open. Two of the Rastem brought it across the doors, knowing that despite the thickness of the doors and lock, any Fempiror could eventually get through by way of their own brute strength. It gave them time, though. He looked at those who remained as they all lowered their hoods. Yori, Kaltesh, and Boltash all made it through, along with Tyran, Falta, Portan, James, and Thomas. The group had varying degrees of experience, and Tiberius feared that some of them would not survive if they were unable to find an exit. Behind them rested the high-ceilinged cavernous room that served as the sanctuary of the church. Back in the early days of the Fempiror Council, they had built the church for both Fempiror and humans to gather for worship. The walls were white with decorative and functional columns placed evenly along them, with ornate stained glass windows allowing the outside light to illuminate the room. The builders had placed the windows so that if a Fempiror were present during a day's session, there would be places to sit out of the direct sunlight, though most Fempiror had attended at night. The room could easily hold 1,000 in attendance in row after row of pews that stretched almost to the front of the room. The front of the room was raised 4 steps above the rest, for the priest to speak to the congregation at the lectern off to the right, behind which rested the keyboards for the organ, whose pipes stretched to the ceiling and through the room. A large cross served as the centerpiece for the front of the room, and put aside any doubt as to the religion practiced here. The council had spared no expense or talent in building this place, and it both grieved and comforted Tiberius that their last stand could be here. "That won't hold them," Yori said, bringing Tiberius out of his thoughts. "No," Tiberius agreed, "but it'll take a few moments for them to break it down. Do we hold any advantages in here?" "Not even a narrow entry," Kaltesh said. "The pews might provide some obstacles, but those would affect us as much as them." "This may be it for us then," Tiberius said without much hope at all. "Yori, see if there's a way out through the catacombs back there." He pointed to the far end of the sanctuary. "Yes, sir," Yori said. "Tyran, Boltash, come with me." Yori ran to the front of the church along with Tyran, one of the youngest of their number, who was even younger than David was when he was transmutated, with a shock of red hair, green eyes, and an appropriately timid look about him, and Boltash, carefully avoiding the sunlight streaming in through the stained glass windows. They disappeared through a door on the front left side of the sanctuary, which led to the tombs. The footfalls of Yori and her team echoed through the enormous empty room until they died out as she made her way further and further down the passage. Then all was silent. They heard no sound from outside. Even the sound of their breathing was nearly inaudible. It was a deafening silence that Tiberius knew would be the calm before the storm. Yet the degree of silence was more than unnerving. "Why aren't they doing anything?" Kaltesh asked, breaking the silence. His voice echoed loudly through the room, even though he spoke quietly. "I fear what they are doing, as opposed to what they aren't," Tiberius said. I find it unlikely that they just let us go." Suddenly, a soft patter of footfalls sounded through the room. Tiberius looked around the room and saw nothing. No one. The room was empty, except for the 6 Rastem who waited patiently for the return of Yori and her team. Tiberius looked toward the door out of the sanctuary, but Yori had not yet returned. He considered that perhaps they should have all gone together to explore the back of the church, but there was no way to be certain of what they would find, or if the position back there would be any better than the one they had now. He knew they would have plenty of warning before the mutations broke through the door, or even came in the windows in case they need to retreat. Yet nothing had happened. The sound grew louder. They each circled, looking for the source of the sound. "What is that?" Falta asked. Falta was a woman appearing to be around 23 with jet black hair, deep brown eyes, and shorter than average height. Tiberius looked at the floor, wondering if perhaps they had found a way in through a lower level. But if they had, they would not be able to hear them yet. Still, the sound grew louder, as if an army were slowly making its way inside. Then an impossible thought hit him. As the number of footfalls continued to increase, Tiberius slowly turned his eyes to the ceiling. He felt his stomach rise into his throat as his mouth gaped in utter shock. "God in heaven," Tiberius said, unable to find any other words. The others glanced at him, and then turned their gaze to the ceiling as well. The mutations scurried upside down on the ceiling as if it were a floor, all 11 of them. Their hands and feet stuck to the surface like insects, and they moved very fast. "What devilry is this?" Kaltesh asked in surprise. There was no time to think, however. The mutations were upon them. "Stand ready," Tiberius exclaimed. The mutations dropped to the floor, just out of range of the Rastem swords. James was the first to attempt an attack. The mutation ducked and delivered a swing to him, tossing James out the window. The mutation followed right behind him, and a scream issued from outside as the mutation fed on his blood and the sun scorched his skin. The remaining 5 Rastem formed a small circle to help defend themselves against the onslaught of mutations, but at 10-5 they were overwhelmed. With every swing they made at the mutations, the creatures avoided the blow. No one was able to get a single hit on any one of them. The only positive was that as long as they kept the mutations busy avoiding their strikes, they were unable to attack. This position was lost quickly, however. Tiberius saw what was happening an instant before it happened. Porton swung his sword wide at one mutation, and another took its place before Porton could recover. It grabbed Porton's tunic with its teeth and tossed him directly into the sunlight of one of the windows. Before Porton could move, the mutation jumped across the room and set its teeth into Porton's neck. Porton screamed in pain, but his screams ended quickly. Tiberius watched powerlessly as other mutations approached those who feasted on his Rastem and engaged in a minor scuffle over who would drink the blood of his warriors. The disgusting sight distracted Tiberius just long enough for a mutation to work its way past his defense and kick Tiberius into the sun as well. The mutation attempted to jump on Tiberius as the sun burned him, but he rolled out of the way before the mutation could land. Tiberius jumped to his feet and ran the mutation through. The mutation collapsed, dead. "So you still die like the rest of us," Tiberius commented upon seeing his small victory. But there was no time to rejoice. Another mutation set upon Tiberius instantly, and he defended himself once more. He also found that at some point after he was thrown into the sun, Thomas had lost against the mutation and lay dead near Porton. Tiberius worked his way back to Kaltesh and Falta to try to hold off the mutations. Suddenly, a welcome voice heralded across the room. "Come on!" Yori screamed. The 3 remaining fighters broke their defense and ran full speed across the room to Yori and her group, who led them quickly through the left door. The mutations apparently had not expected this, since they stood dumbfounded just long enough for the 3 remaining fighters to get away. They did not pause for long, however, and Tiberius glanced back to find their opponents close behind them. Yori immediately turned again once they passed through the door to the right and down a flight of carved stone steps. Yori pulled out a self-lighting torch and led them through the dirt-encrusted catacombs beneath the church. Tiberius did not care where they were going. He only hoped that the maze of tunnels would slow down their pursuers just enough for them to find some kind of exit down here. With 2/3 of their original group now dead, retreat was their only option, and he prayed that survival was possible.